Welcome to a new edition of our Connecting East and West podcast series. With me, your host journalist, Luis Alberto Pino. Connecting East and West is an initiative by East Consulting, the leading business and legal advisory firm bridging businesses between Asia and Latin America. Connecting East and West is your monthly space dedicated to bringing helpful ideas and high caliber views on the business landscape of these two regions. Connecting East and West by East Consulting is your partner to connect and make the most of both worlds. And I'm sure you are going to enjoy the next 25 minutes of conversation with our very special guest today, Gita Wirjawan. Hopefully I'm pronouncing well your name, Gita. Gita is the founder and chairman of Ancora Group, an Indonesian business group with interests in real estate, natural resources, arts, and technology. He's also the founding partner of E-Class Capital, a Southeast Asia private equity fund. Previously, Gita served as Indonesia's Minister of Trade between 2011 and 2014, and was the chairman of the Investment Coordinating Board between 2009 and 2011 of Indonesia, and held senior roles at Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan as well. He currently serves as a visiting scholar at the Precourt Institute of Energy, the Door School of Sustainability at Stanford University, focusing on Southeast Asia's nation-building directionality. And believing in the region's underlying power, Gita hosts Endgame, an educational podcast featuring notable thinkers, leaders, and change makers. And of course, and this is going to be an important part of our conversation today, Gita is the author of a recently launched book titled What It Takes, Southeast Asia, a pursuit to bring Southeast Asia to the forefront of global consciousness. So, Gita, welcome to Connecting East and West.
Thank you, Luis, for inviting me to the show. It's a pleasure.
Okay, so let's begin by talking about your book. And it's interesting that you begin your book in the prologue with a quote by Ibn Khaldun, really, an Islamic scholar, historian, philosopher, and sociologist, and an Arab one, right, from the 13th and 14th centuries. And then you quote him as saying, "History is an art of valuable doctrine, numerous in advantages and honorable in purpose. It informs us about bygone nations in the context of their habits, the prophets in the context of their lives, and kings in the context of their states and politics. So those who seek the guidance of the past in either worldly or religious matters may have that advantage." Gita, why history? Why this quote? Why this author? And why history is so important in your view to understand or even to grasp current dynamics related to ASEAN?
Well, first of all, Ibn Khaldun is one of the most preeminent and prominent scholars and philosophers of all time, in my view. And he would, I think, put a lot of premium on the importance of humanities, looking at history as to learn, from our past mistakes and, of course, successes. But also, he is also in a camp that believes that there is this importance for humanity to basically reinvestigate pre-existing truth or presumptions or axioms. I think it's important for Southeast Asians, and this is now in the context of the writing of the book, to understand the richness of our history. As much as we are, populated with around 700 million people, blessed with, $4 trillion worth of goods and services in terms of economic value. A population of 700 million people places us as the third largest population after India and China, a $4 trillion economy places us as the number 6th economy in the world after US, China, EU, Germany, and Japan. And that, I think, situates us in a really nice way, and in a much nicer way on the back of a very rich history of our being able to embrace multipolarity. Our region has been grazed by different civilizational, economic, cultural, religious influences, and in the past 2,000 years, being grazed by Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam, Christianity. Despite all that, we've been able to remain relatively very peaceful and stable. And peace and stability are a sine qua non for anybody to put food on the table faster and better and more. So the onus is on us going forward as to try to move the economy, better and faster, and hopefully with a better way to distribute, welfare to the masses. And I think we're sort of like entering what I call a geopolitical watershed, in the sense that we see China and the West as indispensable inevitabilities, which will serve as countervailing forces, which, in my view, will entail tremendous degree of geopolitical stability for Southeast Asia. So as such, we would have to basically just take advantage of this equilibrium, geopolitically speaking, by way of looking at China, I think increasingly more for technological capital allocation because it's cheaper, not necessarily better, but cheaper, but increasingly better. And then looking at the West more for economic capital allocation purposes. If we can do that by way of increasing our marginal productivity, by way of moving up the value chain, by way of moving up the global geopolitical order, then I think there's a chance for people around the world to be much more familiar with Southeast Asia and Southeast Asians. Unfortunately, Southeast Asians don't tell our stories to each other and to the world as well as we should. And this is empirically manifested in the little degree to which we trade with each other. Our intra-trade within Southeast Asia is only about 23% of the collective GDP. So in a context of a $4 trillion GDP, we're trading to each other at a rate of less than $1 trillion, unlike the Europeans who can trade with each other at a rate of close to 65%. So I think that is largely correlated with our inability to tell stories to each other. If we tell stories to each other better, I think we understand as to how we need to be producing goods and services that are much more in complementarity as opposed to in competition. And if we tell stories to the rest of the world, I think we run a much better chance of producing goods and services that are not only in competition, but also in complementarity with the rest of the world.
Perfect. Perhaps we should clarify that we talk about Southeast Asia, but your book is pretty much focused on ASEAN, right? Which is the 10-member bloc, right? 10-member nations bloc made up of Brunei, Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos, Malaysia, Myanmar, the Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam. I think that's important, especially on this side of the Pacific, right, in Latin America, where ASEAN is not perhaps so well known as in your part of the world. I would like now to go to one of the questions that you ask yourself in the book, right? When you say, when you ask yourself, why has this region remained underdeveloped despite its long and relatively peaceful history, large population, abundant natural resources, and societal resilience? Why do you think that's been the case over the centuries?
Just to clarify, the book is not only about ASEAN, but it's about Southeast Asia, at the exclusion of Timor-Leste, which is a new member of ASEAN, which just joined just a few days ago at the last meeting of ASEAN in Kuala Lumpur. The book was written, a few months ago. The reason as to why we're not projecting, whatever we are supposed to be projecting to the rest of the world is largely because of the educational attainment divergence. We have one country called Singapore that has been able to attain education in a really good way, by way of placing itself as the #1 country when it comes to PISA, which measures the lingual proficiency and the STEM proficiency of 15-year-olds. Singapore has toppled China. Now China is the #2 in the world. And then we have Vietnam as the only other country in Southeast Asia that places above the global average score of PISA, whereas the other 8 are well below the global average. And this is a bit unfortunate because we're living in an era where the global challenges are evolving at a much more exponential rate as they relate to geopolitics, economics, technology, and climate. Now, at the tertiary level, the university education, Southeast Asia has close to 10,000 universities with around 20 million students, as compared to China only having around 3,000 universities with around 40 million students. But clearly, China has been able to project its intellectual tertiary power to the world by way of not only the goods and services that we're consuming on a day-to-day basis, but also the research and development capabilities. So I think the way forward and the way out of this conundrum for Southeast Asia is to really reduce the pre-existing educational attainment divergence. That would, I think, require emulating the best practice of education in places like Singapore, but also investing much more, proactively in the quality of teachers and the compensation structure of teachers. Secondarily, curricula and technology. I do believe that the investment in high quality teachers would game change any region, including Southeast Asia.
And letting aside the case of Singapore, which is quite well known and worldwide, are you seeing progress on that front in other Southeast Asian nations?
There is progress. Like take Indonesia, for example. A few years ago, we re-legislated our pre-existing legislation as to spend at least by law 20% of our government budget for educational purposes, as opposed to previously only 3 to 4%. So this is, I think, a step in the right direction. It doesn't mean it's perfect already. I think the perfection of this will involve, I think, much more targeted investment in high quality teachers. And this is also being emulated in other countries. But what I propose in the book is to actually relook at the principle of non-interference at the ASEAN level. ASEAN has been known for being able to cultivate consensus building amongst all the member countries without interfering with respect to any member country. I do believe that some degree of supranationalism within ASEAN, only for purposes of educational attainment, would be necessary. And I think, if we keep relying on each government of the member countries outside Singapore, I think it will take a very long time to be able to reduce that divergence. We're actually at risk of, furthering and expanding that pre-existing divergence if we were to be able to infuse that supranationalism within ASEAN as to propagate and impose upon each member country by way of emulating Singapore's best practice in education. I think we might have a much better chance in reducing the pre-existing divergence.
In that sense, in your book, you point out actually the case of the European Union. What exactly is that? Are those assets that you think the Southeast Asian nations should be looking into the European case?
No, that's not what I'm advocating. I don't think ASEAN should be equated with the EU.
Okay.
In the sense that it should unionize from an immigration standpoint, it should unionize from a monetary standpoint. This is on the back of.
And in terms of education, maybe.
Only on education, but outside education, I think it's a much tougher call because the monetary space and the fiscal space of each country is so different from each other it just doesn't make any sense yet to unionize the region from a monetary, much less fiscal standpoint. So I think education is really first and foremost for consideration.
Okay. And talking about main considerations as to where ASEAN stands today, right, in terms of against the backdrop of the current geopolitics and swift and structural changes to the global system, especially impacting on international trade. You said in your book that the time may be right for ASEAN to take a more active role, right, in setting regional standards for critical structural problems impending development. And also you go on by saying that Southeast Asia must capitalize on this disruption by focusing on China and its bloc for affordable technological capital allocation, as well as the United States and its bloc for economic capital allocation. Well, this looks like quite a challenge, doesn't it?
It does, but it's also an opportunity. I think when it comes to economic relations, it's a given that Southeast Asia has tremendous economic relations with China. Our collective trade last year was around $1 trillion. As it regards to economic relations between Southeast Asia and the US, last year the trade was around $530 billion. So the presumption is that the train has left the station when it comes to Southeast Asia and China at a higher velocity and higher acceleration. However, China is able to produce technological capital that is highly affordable for many developing countries. And keep in mind that most countries in Southeast Asia, outside Brunei and Singapore, the other eight do not have a GDP per capita more than $13,250. Even Malaysia is still at around $12,000, Indonesia at $5,000, the Philippines at $3,000, some others at below $2,000 per capita per year. They can't afford expensive technological capital. Now, on the other hand, the West or the US and its Western friends and allies, including their friends in the Middle East, they're managing a liquidity of around $140 trillion, which has not been diversified out to many parts of the world. And this is largely because of the lack of rule of law in many destination countries. And secondly, it's because of the inability of many developing economies to translate from uncertainties to risks. So this is, I think, something that I think Southeast Asia needs to work on much more proactively in terms of enforcing whatever that needs to be enforced. We call that rule of law, but also teaching people STEM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, so that they can better quantify, they can measure, they can predict, and they can price risks. Risks are priceable, whereas uncertainties are not priceable. To the extent that anything is priceable, it's oxygen for capital formation or economic capital formation. Now, Southeast Asia produces only around 750,000 STEM products per year compared to India's ability to produce 2.5 million STEM products per year and China's ability to produce 4.5 million STEM products per year. So if we conceptualize competing with the Indias and Chinas of the world going forward, we need to move that denominator from 750,000 to at least 1.5 to 2 million per year so that we can better translate from uncertainties to risk so that we can tap into this massive economic capital formation from the West.
And do you see, in this sense, Gita, do you see the conditions and especially, let's say, the political will and level of consciousness among ASEAN leaders to set off such a journey?
Not unanimously, but there are some that are taking ownership with this ownership. That's why I wrote this book to socialize this, to a greater scale, not only at the elite level, but also to the non-elite level. And I'm a believer of the need to bottom up a new culture of thinking in the absence of a necessary top-down type of propagation for a new type of culture that embraces internationalism. You know, I do believe that if we take the 10 to 20-year view for Southeast Asia and the world, I think we've got a great chance. And I say this with full sensitivity to the fact that we're a region of peace and stability, and we're likely, moving ahead, in kind of geopolitical watershed that I think will entail peace and stability for many parts of the world.
And in connection with this, I find interesting that you decided to put the word consciousness in the title of your book. I mean, instead of, I don't know, for example, power, I don't know, some other harder word, right? Connected with hard power. Consciousness. It's all around consciousness.
Correct. And then just some empirical evidence to support that there's only around 375,000 publications about Southeast Asia. Globally speaking, there's about 140 million publications. So, the number of publications about Southeast Asia only represents about 0.27% of the number of all global publications. It doesn't make any sense for a region that represents around 9% of the global population. So it just means that we're not telling stories about ourselves and to the rest of the world. So which means that I think the level of awareness or consciousness of the world with respect to Southeast Asia is not where it's supposed to be yet, but we can get there by way of taking the long view.
And that's gonna be critical, I guess, to get to the level of autonomy that you also point out in your book, that it's important for the region as a short-term goal, right? And autonomy vis-a-vis China and the U.S. and the sort of conundrum that we are all going through in terms of geopolitics and geoeconomics, right?
Correct. I think this unilateralism that's being espoused by the U.S. Is allowing the U.S. and many others to better define, who gets to be a friend, who gets to be an enemy, and who gets to be a swing state. I do believe that a region of 700 million people and $4 trillion worth of goods and services, on the back of its ability to embrace multipolarity for the last many years, deserves to be a swing state. We have optionality. I don't see the region being pushed to the corner as to choose one over the other. I think we'll be able to choose between a Huawei and an iPhone, for a long time. And that optionality is worth a lot. I think Southeast Asians need to realize that and recognize that in order to capitalize on that, we've got to increase our cognitive capacity. We've got to increase our ability to distribute cognitive capacity so that we can, as you aptly pointed out, move up the value chain, move up the global geopolitical order, and expand upon our pre-existing strategic autonomy. Now, the optionality is also empirically manifested in our ability for some countries to join the CPTPP, to join the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, to join the OECD, to join the BRICS, to join the BRI. So it just depicts our optionality to go anywhere, which I think is an underrated value proposition.
Okay, so this podcast is about connecting East Asia in particular and Latin America. So I couldn't finish this conversation without asking you about Latin America, right? And Latin America and ASEAN or Southeast Asia in broader terms, if you want. What are the opportunities that you foresee between, in terms of an increasing connection between these two regions? Many Latin American countries, Chile, Peru, for example, are looking into ASEAN nations for opportunities. We also know that ASEAN nations are opening up their markets to foreign blocs, to other regions. So, what's your take on this moment in terms of trade, in terms of investment promotion, and also increasing mutual knowledge, right, between our regions, Latin America and Asia.
Well, I think the economic relations between Latin America and Southeast Asia are not where they're supposed to be. They're way below where they're supposed to be, and it goes back structurally to what I pointed out earlier, in that we're not projecting the narrative to the rest of the world as well, as quickly, as much as we should. And I envision the day when there's 5 storytellers from each country of the 10 countries in Southeast Asia, to be able to go around the world and tell the stories. I think that will engage a much more, not only fruitful conversation, but also discussion and discourse. That I think will translate into a much better multilateralization. Uh, and at a time like this, when we're going through this episodic stress with respect to the U.S., I don't see this as being secular, to be quite honest. Uh, in this episodic, type of scenario, uh, the opportunity abounds for everybody to re-engage with each other. One example of that, further engagement effort is, the visit by President Lula of Brazil to Indonesia just a few days ago, the offset or outside of the ASEAN summit in Malaysia. Uh, I do believe that, it doesn't just take the Latin American leaderships to engage, but I think the Southeast Asians, they need to engage Latin America in a much more proactive manner. And the fortunate part about this is that I think we're living with increasingly, you know, internationalist leaderships in Southeast Asia, including that in Indonesia. He is of a huge degree of internationalism. He wants to engage with the international community. He's been to Europe, the US, and many parts of Asia. I would bet on his agenda. I think he's considering, re-engaging, if not further engaging with Latin America, not only for economic relations, but I think for geopolitical reasons. In the sense that, it is high time for all of us to realize that, whatever is happening with the U.S. is episodic, but we need to re-engage multilaterally.
Mm-hmm. There are, just to finish, Gita, there are a few trade negotiations ongoing. For example, Chile is negotiating with the Philippines, with Indonesia, Peru the same. Also, there are talks with Vietnam and Thailand. Um, if you had to choose, let's say, 2 or 3 tips, recommendations for Latin Americans and negotiators and those business people interested in, enter ASEAN markets, what those tips would be?
Well, most parts of Southeast Asia or ASEAN are developing economies. And a typical developing economy, uh, it's not about what you know, it's about who you know. So developing economies are pretty much a who you know model, not a what you know model. If you keep that in mind and you cultivate and harness the relationships with the right people who can navigate through, the web of relationships, I think you're likely to do well. And second, I think, Southeast Asians tend to take the long view. They don't, well, I mean, some take the short view, but I think predominantly most people take the long view. So that I think is going to help in terms of cultivating and harnessing a much more fruitful relationship between Latin America and Southeast Asia.
Okay. Well, good. It's been a short but a conversation full of really insightful elements. I really appreciate your time, and thank you for being with us in connecting the East and West. And it's been really, really a pleasure.
Thank you, Luis.
And to all of our followers, don't miss out on our next episode of Connecting East and West. in which we will continue to explore the business opportunities and overall business landscape between Asia and Latin America. Bye-bye to all of you. Bye-bye, Gita.
Bye-bye.